August 15, 1945. Inside a cliffside cave that smelled of salt and old smoke, a rusted scalpel rested at a woman's throat. She held it like someone holding a promise and a verdict at once. The blade had been wrapped in cloth to hide its shine, but the cloth could not hide the thin, relentless tremor of her hands. Around her, 3 children lay curled on mats, small ribs pressing against ragged shirts, cheeks hollow like shells. The cave roof dripped in slow, patient beats. Voices from outside were not voices of comfort. They were the shapes of orders and fear, brittle as broken glass. Her name was Ayako. Once she had been a nurse in a place that now felt like another life. Clean floors, steady rhythms, the ritual of folding bandages so that they smelled faintly of iodine and soap. Those memories came in flashes, like photographs viewed in someone else's hand. Hunger blurred the edges, pain sharpened them. They had taught her what the Americans were: monsters, devils who left no mercy. Schools, posters, whispered warnings on the street, everything had carved that belief into her bones. Dying in the cave with the scalpel at her throat would be clean. It would be honorable. It would end the waiting. A child's small voice, so thin it was almost a memory, made her look down. Keiko, 9, reached for her with a hand that smelled of seaweed and the last of a canned sweet. "One-san," the girl said. "Sister." Her voice was a thread. "Mizu." Water. Her lips were cracked. Ayako's fingers closed around the scalpel. The choice was no longer abstract. Boots came then, a rhythm on a path outside the cave. Not the heavy, menacing tread she'd expected, but something urgent. There were shouts in English, clipped and unfamiliar. Light edged the cave mouth in splinters. A face appeared, sunburned, with eyes that looked like the sea in winter, blue, sharp. Behind him, more faces, uniforms, the smell of oil and tobacco. They moved like people unsure of what they might find. "Hands," a voice said in broken Japanese, the syllables clumsy but intention clear. A woman stepped forward beside the man. Her apron was stained in a way that looked like a map of late nights and small wars. She spoke a few soft words in Japanese that sounded practiced, the way a traveler practices phrases before leaving a country. "Anata wa daijobu?" Water? Food? Ayako's scalp prickled. For a moment she could not tell whether the voice belonged to threat or mercy. The soldier with eyes like winter watched the children. He fumbled, awkward and careful, with something ribboned in tin. Chocolate. Not a bar of propaganda, but a small, glossy rectangle wrapped like a peace offering. The woman knelt, offering water in a dented canteen. "Please," she said in Japanese, though not perfectly. "Drink. She didn't finish the sentence the way Ayako's world wanted her to. She did not say the word that would seal the truth, that would render Ayako's earlier lessons obsolete. Americans. Instead, she said, "We help." Ayako's throat bobbed. The scalpel felt heavier. The children looked up with mouths that had been empty too long. Keiko's eyes bored into Ayako, as if asking where the duty lay, in sacred honor or in a hand that needed tending. A memory rose uninvited. A patient who had smiled once upon recovery, a laugh caught in a ward like a fluttering flag. The scalpel's edge bit a tiny line into her palm. Slowly, as if sinking a stone into a pond, Ayako let the blade fall to the mat between her and the children. It landed with a soft metallic sound. Silence widened, then rearranged. "She can come," the soldier with the sea-blue eyes, Dr. Thompson, one of the medical unit's officers, said, as if naming something simple. He did not brand her with a title. He did not demand an oath. He handed the chocolate to the smallest child, who accepted it like an offering from a stranger who had somehow become a god. They bound her, not in steel, but in care. A blanket wrapped around shoulders that had been caked with dirt, a hand on the small of her back to guide her. There was a moment, only one, where she looked at the cave's darkness and felt a stab of something like grief for the life she was leaving behind. Then the light outside pressed against her eyelids, and the world shifted. They called her a prisoner once they loaded her into a jeep, an official word meant to make tidy the messy fact of rescue. Ayako's hands went still at that, not because the label hurt, but because the word carried a strange new weight. Custody, not of accusation, but of someone else's responsibility. It fit neither the doctrine she'd been fed, nor the small human truth that hunger had become the reason she had survived. She told herself, silently, that she had been taken into a place where decisions would be made for her body and, perhaps, later, in ways for her life. The ride smelled of diesel and sweat and surgical bandages. The children, huddled like small islands, clutched at the pockets of the American uniforms. Miller, 23 and too young for a war, kept glancing back as if apologizing for the enormity of their arrival in this private, shadowed cave. He spoke very little. When he did, his voice was a whisper of English gentleness. Almost there. The field hospital lay not far, a cluster of canvas tops and hurried light, a place tuned to the sounds of emergency. The clink of metal, the low hum of generators, orders traded carelessly like spare coins. Inside, everything had been arranged around the calculus of saving. Tents opened like gills. People moved through them with an economy born of repeated necessity. Smells were sharp, antiseptic, boiled cloth, the faint, sweet ghost of alcohol. It was a different world from the cave, bright, clinical, and no less raw in its intimacy. Ayako was carried as if she were both fragile and dangerous. Her wounds were not entirely visible at first. Tattered sleeves, a bandage at the jawline, but when Dr. Thompson drew it back, the smell that rose was a sour, acidic thing. Infection. Flesh that had been gnawed by time and neglect. Embedded in that, small, jagged pieces of metal like the teeth of some indifferent machine. Shrapnel. The word came with a clinical crispness that could make a surgeon's hands steady and a patient's heart colder. Shrapnel, deep. Infection, Dr. Thompson said, moving his hands in fast, efficient gestures. He had no theatrics. The urgency was its own voice. He barked orders, IV, scalpel, suction. Sarah, who had been offering quiet care at the entrance, stepped forward with a tray. Her Japanese was better than the others. Not perfect, but enough to soften edges. She murmured, "Daijobu. I'll try to make it better," and the syllables folded around Ayako like a bandage. They did not waste words. Anesthesia was a luxury that war sometimes denied. They gave what they could, a burn of morphine, a sting of local to dull the area, and then began. The operation was a choreography. Hands, murmured instructions, instruments glinting with a focus that was almost prayer. They cleaned the wound, lifting dead tissue away, rinsing with saline until it looked more like promise than rot. They dug carefully for the metal teeth that had lodged inside her flesh. Each piece came out with a tiny sound, metal and soft tissue saying goodbye. Ayako's mind split into fragments, sharpened by pain and dulled by drugs. She watched the men and women over her as if they were actors in a play she could not influence. Dr. Thompson's eyes, when he glanced down, were steady. They were not triumphal. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to measure success in the quiet way of counting breaths regained. Miller's hands were gentle. Sarah's voice kept threading short Japanese phrases between English orders, smaller sutures of language meant to hold. She remembered, in the midst of it all, a child she had once treated who had called for his mother even as the bandages tightened. She had murmured nonsense to ease him. Without quite deciding to, she folded the memory into the edge of the present and let it hold her. Pain arrived in waves, but the worst of the infection was pulled out with the metal. When the last shard was removed, there was a brief, immaculate hush, a moment when the world resembled, very faintly, a life that could continue. They stitched the wound, the thread busy and precise. The surgeon's hands moved like someone composing an apology and a contract at the same time, a promise that the body would be mended, and a recognition that no single stitch could erase what had happened. During the operation, Ayako did not ask for anything that would require words. Later, when the song of anesthesia thinned, she asked, faltering, in Japanese, "My family?" The question was almost a sound. Sarah bent over her and placed a cool hand against her forehead. "We will help you get stronger," she said, careful. She did not, and could not, answer the question of who lived and who did not. That knowledge was not in the hospital's hands. It was elsewhere, in rumors and static on radios, in the news that came as a different kind of wound. They called her a prisoner on the paperwork. The word fit poorly with the tenderness of a blanket tucked up to her chin and a soldier kneeling to hold a spoon to a small mouth. Yet in the formal ledger of conflict, the term had bureaucratic force. To the men and women in the tent, it meant she was under their responsibility. To Ayako, it was both accusation and shelter. Recovery after the operation was uneven and intimate. The children circled her bed like small planets. Keiko brought her a scrap of something sweet, a memory of chocolate now shared between hands. Yuki, younger and quieter, touched Ayako's bandage as if checking the map of a wound for a story. Hiroshi, the smallest, drummed his small fingers against the canvas until the sound turned into nonsense and then sleep. They taught each other names. Ayako learned thirst, food, safe in English, the words clumsy and precious. Miller taught the children to tie knots in the ropes around the stretchers. Sarah taught Ayako how to fold a new kind of bandage, one that could be given without the old scripts of honor and shame. Small rituals replaced grand pronouncements. The language of care, hand over shoulder, the gentle pressure of a wrapped wound, the singing of a lullaby in a tent lit by a single bulb, built a new grammar between them. At night, after the generators hummed down and the tent smelled of boiled tea and detergent, Ayako lay awake and listened to the people who had saved her cough into sleep. She watched Dr. Thompson moving between beds like someone attending to commitments, not victories. He did not speak much to the patients. He spoke to the staff, to the maps, to the instruments. Yet once, late, he sat at the foot of her cot and said, softly, and in Japanese that was awkward but deliberate, "You are safe now. We will not hurt you here." She wanted to ask him if safety could be loaned like a blanket, if it could cover the parts that were always cold. Instead, she listened and let the word settle like a small pebble in the chest. It did not change the truth that she'd known for months, that the world was a long list of things taken and returned unevenly. News arrived in fragments. Radios in the officers' tent spat out waves of static and then clipped phrases, rumors, shivers of information that could not be trusted until a pattern formed. Men and women lingered at the edges of their duties to catch the sound of words. A young orderly whispered about cities and the suddenness of fire, about places Ayako had named before, though she could not know then which names were about to become broken like old plates. Ayako learned to read faces for the news they carried. Sometimes, two people spoke in low tones and then looked toward her with an expression that trembled between pity and guilt. She could not parse it into anything more than a mood until the morning light came and the tent filled with new work. She began to move slowly beyond the hold of those first days. Her hunger, which had once been a constant, gnawed at a different rhythm now. Food tasted like a miracle. A bowl of rice was peeled light as possibility. A spoonful of soup made steam that smelled like the world continuing. With recovery came the small indignities of healing. Scars itched with the language of repair. The children asked her to show them the marks, curious, and she told them, in a voice that had no pride and no apology, "This is where I was saved." Keiko asked, with a clarity that cut softer than any knife, "Saved by them, the ones you were supposed to hate?" The question hung like a bell. Ayako did not answer in the way the doctrine required. She found instead that her hand rose to the child's head and stroked hair that had been bleached by the sun and worries. "We were hungry," she said. It was a small truth, and in that moment, truth was enough to begin piecing her life back together. One afternoon, Dr. Thompson found her sitting with a ledger of sorts, the way nurses kept their days, lists of needs, names of patients, things to be done. He did not carry the sanctimony of a rescuer. He carried instead a practical face, focused, a little tired, the edges softened by the habit of attending to unavoidable badness. He sat beside her without being asked and traced, with a finger, the names she'd copied. He looked up at her and said, simply, "We need you to tell us about the children, about what they need." The sentence was a request dressed as authority. She looked at the three small faces clustered nearby. Their whole world had been compressed into stolen cans, half-broken toys, and the grace of strangers. For a moment she felt the old doctrine, the claim that living while one's people suffered was shame, try to pull her under again. Then she saw Keiko's hopeful mouth, the small hand that reached for her bandage as if it were proof of possibility. "Yes," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. It was, implicitly, an acceptance of a strange bargain. To live under the care of those she had been taught to hate, if that living meant she could act for the children who were not yet hardened by lessons of propaganda. It was not a surrender of identity. It was a practical decision in a world stripped to essentials: food, water, warmth, the chance to breathe. In the days that followed, she moved like someone learning to trust a new map. She checked wounds, learned the precise language of the field hospital's routines, and, against all scripts, found herself being allowed to fold bandages for others. The paradox of being a prisoner in the paperwork and a caregiver in the tents did not resolve itself neatly. It became instead a lived tension, a ledger of obligations, small acts of dignity administered amid asymmetry. Miller watched her with that careful look of a man who had seen too much but still believed in small human transactions. One evening he handed her a small pocket mirror, saying, in English with Japanese words mixed in like thread through cloth, "You look tired. You are stronger." She smiled, an expression threaded with surprise. The mirror showed a face that had been made by war and by care, bruised but not erased. The children began to follow her through the tents like shadows. Ayako found herself teaching them the basics she had once taught other children's wounds: where to press to stop bleeding, how to keep a bandage clean, the tiny ritual of washing hands before feeding. They learned quickly. The acts were practical, but they were also a language of repair, and in teaching them, Ayako felt a slow adjustment in her chest. She was no longer only a receiver of care. She was a giver. At night, exhausted, she would sit beneath the dim bulb and write small lists, names, items, questions, on scraps of paper. She did not allow herself the luxury of fantasies that would be cruel. She wrote instead things that could be acted upon tomorrow. Sometimes she wrote the word for mother and then crossed it out because the answer it demanded was too large. Sarah found her once, late, with her head folded into her hands. She sat opposite and offered a small wrapped square of chocolate, like the first truce. "For you," she said in Japanese, clumsy but earnest. "For help, for being here." Ayako took it and put it slowly to her lips. The taste was small and bright. It was not the whole of anything, but it was enough to remind her that appetite could be kind of proof of life. They spoke in fragments of language and fuller things through gestures. Trust, in that tent, was not an announcement. It was the accumulation of small acts: a hand steadying a child's chin, a spoon fed into a sleeping mouth, a bandage smoothed over a wound. The men and women who had saved her did not become saints in Ayako's story. They were fallible, sometimes tired, often irritated by the endless demands of the wounded. But they kept coming back to the tasks, and that keeping came to matter as much as any grand statement about good and evil. Days bled into one another with the insistent routine of medicine. Ayako's wound closed. The infection withdrew like a tide lessening. The children grew brighter, cheeks filling with the soft roundness of nourishment. The idea of any name being simple, prisoner, enemy, friend, grew more complex as the facts of human need and human care intersected in ways that propaganda had not prepared her for. And yet the world beyond the canvas continued to shift and make new demands of them all. Rumors circled like birds that had not yet decided which branch to land on. Sometimes the men in the officer's tent paused and listened in small groups. Sometimes, in the middle of some mundane task, a nurse would look up as if anticipating a storm. One night, when the moon hung like a quiet coin over the camp, Dr. Thompson paused by her bed and said, low enough that only she could hear, "We've done what medicine does. We mend bodies. We don't always mend the rest." His voice was neither bitter nor resigned. It was simply the acknowledgement of a limit he had learned to live with. Ayako pressed her fingers into the palm of her hand and felt the roughness there. "What will you call me?" she asked finally, not wanting the bureaucracy to define the horizon of her days. He considered it. The tent hummed with distant conversation, laughter that had nothing to do with relief, a machine's sputtering reassurance. "Patient," he said. "If they write, they'll write prisoner, perhaps, but to us, here, you're someone who needs care." She let the word settle. It was not everything. It was, however, an essential and immediate thing. In the ledger of that tent, she existed as someone whose body they would not leave to rot. Outside, beyond the canvas and the electric lights, the island breathed. Its cliffs rose and fell in the indifferent pattern of geology. The sea hit the rocks in a slow, patient applause. The war had been shaping itself into new forms far from the tender ministrations of the medical tents, and when those forms came, they would not always be negotiable. For now, though, the tent was its own small universe, and in it Ayako began to practice a different kind of living. She practiced by doing things most people took for granted. She stirred a pot of rice and learned to measure on a scale that had nothing to do with ceremony. She learned to laugh at small jokes that tasted like human warmth. She mended a child's shirt with sewing so careful it looked like devotion. And still, at the edges, questions waited. Who had survived? Who had not? Would there be enough medicine to keep going? What would it mean, if it happened, that she was to return some day to a place called home that might not have a place for her anymore? These questions were like distant knocks on a locked door. For the moment, she chose to answer the one nearest, the child's cry, the bandage that needed changing, the patient who opened an eye and saw her, and smiled. Each act of care was an assertion against the shape of a world that made little sense. One morning, months or days into the hazy measure of time, they kept calendars, but time in tense stretches and shrinks in the way of lives under stress. Men came with forms and said coldly the word that carried 1,000 meanings: repatriation. Papers could send you back, or they could keep you here. The detail was bureaucratic, threaded with things Ayako could not control. Yet the idea unsettled her. It implied choices she had not been asked to make. She looked at the children. They were clinging to the patterns of safety they had found in the tent, an adult who would feed them, hands that would not raise a knife. Somewhere behind everything else, the old lessons about honor murmured like ghosts. To go back could mean a return to a judgment she had not passed. To stay was to accept the strange, fragile shelter of the tent, to be called a prisoner on paper while healing others in practice. That night, in the dim light with blanket tucked up to her chin and the 3 small bodies breathing near, Ayako touched the place on her chest where a scar would always remind her of a choice she had made. The island was quiet. The sea kept its slow, indifferent beat. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, how strange it was that she had been saved by hands of those she had been taught to fear. She thought of the scalpel and the chocolate, of the blue eyes steady over the canvas. Somewhere a radio crackled. Voices carried only fragments. The tent held its breaths as if listening for a verdict. Ayako closed her eyes and felt the steady pressure of a hand at her shoulder, Sarah's, offering not an answer, but presence. It was, in the end, what she had come to know as the smallest, truest kind of healing. When the light finally shifted toward the dawn, she sat up slowly and reached for the paper that Miller had left days before. A list of names, tasks, supplies. At the bottom, in a hurried hand, someone had penciled a line that would become the next small decision she would have to face. Options: repatriation, indefinito, stay as hospital staff. She read the word and felt the cave's coolness in her bones for a heartbeat. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into the hem of her blanket. For now, the question could wait. For now, there were hands to steady, children to teach, and the slow, stubborn work of being human in a place that refused simple answers. Outside, the first light of morning made the ocean a flat, wide silver. Inside the tent, life continued its careful ritual. The doctors moved from bed to bed. The bandages were changed. Laughter sometimes leaked through the canvas like an illicit thing. And at the center of it, Ayako began in small, clear acts to stitch together a life that did not fit the tidy categories anyone else could name. A short distance away, Dr. Thompson folded his hands and listened to a faint radio. He did not yet know how much of the world had been rearranged in a way no one in that tent could undo. He only knew that his hands had saved a body, that the paperwork would call her a prisoner, and that she was here, alive, despite everything. He let that fact hold for a little while, as if it were an island in a sea of uncertainties. Some choices, he knew, were not only for doctors to make, but the work of healing, he also knew, often began with the simplest of promises, that when a human being needed a hand, someone would offer it. Did you know about Saipan's civilian caves and the small, desperate decisions they held? Tell us in the comments. The morning moved on. Children chased small patches of sun that fell across the tent. Ayako rose, carefully, and wrapped a new bandage around a child's knee. The motion felt like a language she was relearning, fingers finding the right fold, the right pressure, the gentle knot that did not hurt. At the far edge of the camp, new arrivals came with messages and orders. People hurried with a sense that the world beyond had shifted. Yet inside the tent, the work continued, steady and stubborn. Ayako found a small, fierce satisfaction in the repetition. Each stitch, each spoon, each clean rag was a counterweight to the things she could not yet bear to think about. Then, one afternoon, as a thin rain began to patter on the canvas and the island smelled of damp earth and possibility, a voice, sharp and official, entered the tent. It carried words she had not expected to hear so soon. Men stopped. Even the children, who had learned to make small forts of their attention, looked up. The voice said something about orders and channels and information that would be brought to all the patients. Dr. Thompson's jaw tightened. Sarah's hands stilled. Ayako felt, inexplicably, a resurgence of that old cave darkness. The scalpel gleamed in the memory of her palm. She had been saved from a blade and from hunger, but the wider world had its own, larger blades, and necks that had been counted in ways she could not yet hold. The news, when it would come, would not be a surgical instrument. It would be an event that reshaped everything she'd been trying to rebuild. For now she folded a bandage, smoothed it against a shoulder, and smiled at a child who had not yet learned the grammar of loss. The smile was honest and brave and small. Outside, thunder murmured. Inside, the tent held its breath. The next decision, inevitably, would not be one she could make alone. It would require faith in people whose hands had already shown a willingness to heal. It would ask her whether the life she was being offered, tent by tent, stitch by stitch, was a life she could claim. She met Dr. Thompson's eyes across the room. He saw the question there and did not answer it with a promise he could not keep. He only nodded once, as if to say, "We will try." The tent hummed. Kiko laughed at something small and ridiculous. The bandages smelled faintly of soap. The island rolled on, indifferent and ancient. People inside the tent, newly joined by the rescued, continued the small, everyday work that makes survival a thing of dignity rather than merely endurance. Ayako kept stitching. She kept teaching. She kept listening for the voice that would carry the larger news of the world. She did not yet know how she would answer it, but she had made a choice that would not be undone by words alone. In a place of gray necessities, she had chosen to keep living and to make life livable for the children who dragged themselves toward her like small, hopeful ships. The choice would demand a kind of courage that had nothing to do with old notions of honor. It would be courage measured in spoons, in bandages, in the steadiness of hands extended when hands could equally have closed into fists. When the rain eased and the sunlight returned in thin, quick streaks, someone knocked on the outer canvas. A man arrived with a paper in hand and a face emptied of anything easy. He said, without preface, "There's news. You should hear it." Ayako set the bandage down. She felt the tent's heartbeat like a drum. The world beyond their small hospital had a new shape, and whatever that shape contained, it would reach them in time. For the first time since the scalpel had hovered at her throat, the word prisoner seemed small compared to the size of what the morning might bring. She rose and followed the arc of movement that had become her own, out of the tent, into the open, toward the place where information arrived and where decisions would need to be made. The air tasted like rain and something metallic at the same time. The cliff faces watched as they always had, unmoved, ancient witnesses to human things. Ayako walked with a slow certainty. She was fragile. She was healed in part. She was under the care of those who had stitched her flesh and bound her wounds. She was, now, on the cusp of a new choice, one that would not be about scalpel or chocolate, but about life lived after a newsflash that could turn courage into grief or into a different kind of resolve. She stepped into the light. The soldiers and nurses turned to hear. Dr. Thompson stood among them, a figure of quiet expectation. Sarah's hand rested on the shoulder of a child, steady and warm. Miller's young face looked as if it had already seen too much, but his eyes held a determination that sometimes becomes bravery. A radio warbled in the distance, then rose to a clearer voice. The words were new and terrible in ways no single sentence could hold. People listened, mouths open, the tent empty of all but the sound. In that sound were the outlines of futures and the erasure of others. Ayako's hands curled into fists, not in offer of violence, but to keep the impulse from toppling her. She felt every step of her life up to that moment. The scalpel, the chocolate, the ride in the jeep, the operation, the nights of soup and sewn hems, arranged behind her like a trail. Ahead was the sentence she could not yet read. When the voice stopped, the silence afterward was not empty. It was full of decisions. The radio's words left a hollow in the air inside the tent that felt almost physical. People pressed closer to one another as if proximity could make the meaning less sharp. Ayako stared at the canvas pattern overhead as if the waves of shadow might spell out an answer. The announcer's English was clipped, then threaded with phrases translated and passed around like hot tea. Tens of thousands, someone whispered, because no one in the tent would say a larger number aloud. The syllables hung like flotsam. When she understood, when the name she had heard in fragments at night, the city her mind had tried to protect, joined with the notion of a flash that could swallow whole neighborhoods, her body reacted before thought did. The breath she had been holding since the cave exhaled all at once. She pitched forward as if the air itself had become a weight. Kiko cried out and then put a small hand on her face, as if to keep the woman she had come to rely upon in this particular shape. Sarah crouched where she could be seen and said, in halting Japanese, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The apology was useless for undoing worlds, but it was the only language she had that reached across the barricade of policy and the roar of radio static. That night, Ayako walked away from the tent toward a small clearing where the moon left a pale bruise on the grass. The island seemed to breathe differently, appropriately, horribly indifferent. She felt as if someone had removed an interior scaffold of belief. A structure that had kept grief at bay by neatly cataloging enemies and virtues. Now the categories blurred, and the edges of everything were dangerously soft. Sarah followed at a respectful distance and sat down beside her without announcement. The two of them watched the sea, which remained the sea, and offered no consolation. In the hush, Sarah finally said in a voice that had steeled itself for difficult things over many nights in many tents, "It doesn't make sense. Sometimes nothing about this makes sense. But we can bandage, we can stitch, we can feed. That is something to do." Ayaka looked at her and, for the first time since the scalpel had been at her throat, felt anger that was not aimed at an abstract enemy, but at the shape of fate. "They taught me to die," she said, the words shallow and raw. "They taught us that to live, if living was under their hands, was shame." Sarah's hand found hers, not to soothe by erasing, but to hold as an anchor. "The world teaches terrible things," she said. "You do not have to follow all of them. You can choose what your hands do." It was not a sermon. It was an invitation, small and practical, offered at a moment when sermons could not reach the ruined spaces inside people. Ayaka thought of Kiko's small face, of Hiroshi's drum of fingers, of the way the children had learned to find safety in the repetitive kindnesses of the tent, the bowl at the right hour, the spoon that never hit a child's mouth too hard.
She thought of the surgical light making Dr. Thompson's hands move like someone conducting an impossible quiet. She thought of the ledger page with repatriation scrawled as an option, indefinido.
She stood then, as if lifting herself from a wound, and said, "Then let my hands do something." It was a modest vow, almost too small to be called an oath. Yet it had weight. The choice did not erase grief, it redirected it into something tangible. In the days that followed, the camp became a crucible of practical ethics. The label prisoner sat on paperwork as if a stamp could close a moral ledger. But on the stretchers and in the clinics, paperwork had less power than a steady hand. Ayaka's days acquired a structure: rounds, washings, bandages, the small administration of human needs. She learned to read wounds in the shorthand of scar and patch. She learned, with the slow fidelity of apprenticeship, when a fever would be best met with cool cloth rather than medicine, when to put a child's head against her chest and hum until breathing synced. She also learned to keep two safeties in her mind at once: a careful skepticism born of the propaganda she'd been taught, and a practical trust in the competence she saw in the hands around her. Neither made her naive. Both allowed her to function. There were moments of friction. A handful of rescued Japanese men, scavenged from different pockets of the island, held to a fury that could not bear the sight of uniforms. They spat curses in hurried Japanese when an American nurse reached for a bandage, their voices heavy with the sediment of loss. Ayako did not chastise them. She simply worked, meeting anger with the kind of steady, practical attention designed to stabilize rather than score moral points. One old man refused the soup she offered until she sat on the other side of the tent and ate the same portion from the same bowl. After that, he finished his portion and nodded to her with the stiff gratefulness of someone reconciled to a small kindness. Her role expanded. Staff needed someone who understood both the language of wounds and the cadence of the island's people. Her Japanese eased the sharp edges of miscommunication. Her presence suggested constantly that these tents were not merely an occupying sanitation system, but for now, an ecosystem of care. Dr. Thompson began treating her less like a patient and more like a colleague, asking her to arrange supplies, to teach the children small first aid tasks, to keep a ledger of the names and needs that mattered more than forms. Miller, who had started as a shy assistant, turned into a close ally in the day-to-day work of keeping the camp running. The three children, Keiko, Yuki, Hiroshi, settled deeper into the life that threaded them to Ayako. Word traveled slowly. Messages arrived on folded paper, scratched by hands that had to choose which truths to write. After a week, a new set of orders came. Some personnel would be transferred. The forms again mentioned repatriation, indefinido, and the camp buzzed with the business of shipping people to ports and airports, and sometimes to nowhere anyone could well predict. Ayako placed her name on the list of volunteers to stay. The decision was immediate and deep as a bone. She would not leave the tent that had taught her how to be needed. The ledger would call her a prisoner. She would prefer to be useful. After the initial chaos of the surrender and the broadcasts, the work of the camp took on a steadier rhythm that would last months. With time, new layers of responsibility came to Ayako. She tended to men whose limbs had been mangled by bullets or shrapnel. She soothed the feverish children of American sailors. She stitched the jagged wounds of islanders. Her hands moved with a care that did not fascinate the soldiers. They simply recognized a useful competence. The more she learned, the more she gave back. And in giving, she found that her sense of identity, once a rigid structure defined by party education and social roles, melted into something more porous and, in many ways, truer. There were small miracles,
if miracles in this context can be reduced to the practical. A child who stopped convulsing after a fever broke. An infected wound that did not progress because an early dressing had been applied. A hungry person who learned to trust the bowl offered by an arm they had been taught to hate. Each of these was a tiny defiance against doctrines of absolute enmity. Still, grief found its ways to come like weather. Months into the steady work, once the worst of the immediate infections had been confronted and routine had crept into the camp, a folded letter arrived for Ayako, delivered by a man whose face had the blankness of someone who had read too many scripts of sorrow. The envelope had been opened by hands that had needed to look for names, stamps, anything that could meet the human intelligence behind the paper. Her hands trembled as she slit the flap. The contents were clinical and cold in tone. A list of post office checks and name searches. Results were inconclusive in many cases. Names could be matched, and yet the certainty of death or life was often left as indefinido. There were mentions of destroyed neighborhoods and of ash, the word falling like dust across the page. A portion of the letter, translated for her by Sarah, in a voice that didn't want to break, suggested that there was little reason to hope for survivors from the area where she knew her family had been. The world once again made unbearable demands. Ayako retreated into a corner of the tent and let the ocean be a distant rhythm. She thought of her father, if he had been a man, of the particular way a neighbor's laugh had folded into the cadence of rice time, of small domesticities that made up a life. She watched the children play, and in each laughter she heard an echo of what had been taken. The old doctrine of honor rose like a tide promising absolution if she chose a certain path. But against it was a stronger impulse, the practical ethic she had adopted, which insisted that grief had to be lived and not merely formalized.
Sarah found her, as she always did, and asked nothing to be said. The two women sat with the quiet company of those who had learned that presence is often the only language that works in the aftermath of violent news. "You could go home," Sarah offered, not to push away the ache, but to give Ayako a menu of options. "We could help you get there." Ayako closed her eyes and saw in quick succession the scalpel, the chocolate, the jeep, the field hospital's lamplight. She saw Dr. Thompson's hands steadying a child's chest. Miller's young face creased in concentration, the ledger with the word prisoner stamped in bureaucratic black. She thought, with a slow and terrible clarity, of the children at her side. She felt the pull of a life that had been rebuilt into something with a fragile axis. Finally, she said, aloud to no one and everyone, "My place is here, for now." So she stayed. She signed forms that would keep her on staff, wrote her name in lists that made her a functionary of care rather than an abstract casualty of war. The label on papers could say prisoner. In practice, she was a caregiver, a teacher, a small bureaucrat of medicine. She wore the badge of responsibility with a grim sort of honor. She would choose to stay and to try. The months that followed were a slow accretion of days that formed a life with its own texture. Ayako learned the exact angle at which a child's wound would drain without reopening, the correct warmth of a compress for a fevering brow, the rhythm of a lullaby that made even the most anxious infant still. The children, Keiko, Yuki, Hiroshi, grew under her watch. Keiko learned to read a little. Yuki developed a fondness for folding tiny paper cranes from scraps. Hiroshi never stopped hitting rhythms on the bed frame, but did so with a new brightness in his eyes. The camp's medical staff themselves transformed in modest human ways. Dr. Thompson sometimes left his hands slack and walked out to the cliff edge to look at the ocean as if to return borrowed peace. He wrote letters in spidery script when he could. Miller stopped being the embarrassed young assistant and became a competent technician who could prep an IV in half the time it took others. Sarah's Japanese grew less halting. Her humor returned, dark and quick. They became a small neighborhood with rituals.
The shared cup of tea before dawn, whose aroma pooled like a private city. A ritual of checking lists before dusk. They mended both people and a certain fragile trust. News from the outside world came piecemeal. Sometimes they heard mention of policy debates, of occupation plans, and of reparations that would later take bureaucratic forms. The island, however, remained stubbornly present. Tides, tides, the wind's particular voice in the choral. Ayako's life was no longer only about survival. It included small projects. She began making a ledger of names and stories. Who had been treated, what had been done, who had family somewhere else. She taught other women how to fold bandages and recorded, in careful Japanese, the things she wanted to remember about how to keep both a child's wound clean and a heart steady. There were moments of recognition that cut through the routine. An elderly islander who had been too ashamed to remove his hat for days finally lifted his eyes and said simply, in halting English, "You save." He touched Ayako's hand with a blunt thumb that felt like an old tool. She pressed his fingers and let gratitude work through their shared small economy of usefulness. The field hospital's name, if it had one on paper, meant little in the face of the people who came and went. People did not return to their previous lives overnight. The work of care continued and kept the humanity of the island in motion. Years passed in the strange, elastic time of occupation. Ayako remained on the rolls for long enough that eventually her documents became complicated. The bureaucracy wanted answers. She wanted to answer only with gestures. When the time came that repatriation forms were pressed toward her, the paperwork offered options: transfer, return, potential positions in reconstruction, possibilities in Japan for nurses in rebuilding clinics, yet precise dates were often listed as indefinido. What was clear was an invitation that carried both possibility and the risk of a painful return to a country that might not have room for her. She made the choice, after nights of thinking, of folding bandages, of counting children's breaths, to accept an offer that would carry her back to Japan at a future, non-specific time in order to work in civilian medical relief projects in regions battered by shortages and dislocation. Her reasoning was complicated and not free of sorrow. Part of her wanted to return to the quarry of memory and do some small work that resembled repair. Part of her wanted to carry the lessons of this tent to other places. It was not a triumphant homecoming in the sense of reclaiming a pre-war life. It was a deliberate step toward a new life shaped by what she had learned. Before she left the island, there were small rituals of departure. The children pressed flowers into her hands, damp, fragrant pieces of the island they had all come to love. Miller gave her a small tin of cloth patches, items he said would be useful for sewing in places with little supply. Sarah wrapped a scarf around her neck, a cheap thing but threaded with intent. Dr. Thompson and Ayako stood together by the tent's entry the night before departure. He had folded his hands as if he might fold away some of the words. He said softly, "You have been a bridge here. I don't know what to call it, but it matters." Ayako thought of the word prisoner and how it had sat in the margins of her life like an archived stamp. "We called it what the paper said," she replied, "but I don't feel like a prisoner when I bandage a child." He smiled, small and fragile. "You are who you make with your hands," he said. He couldn't know how much that sentence would someday be quoted. To him, it was simply an observation. To her, it felt like a map. They took a photograph before dawn on the beach. The sky was a thin wash of color. In the photograph, Ayako's smile was small and tired and very real. Dr. Thompson stood beside her, his uniform imperfect, a hand on a hip that had never quite lost the habit of readiness. Miller stood at a respectful angle. Sarah, caught mid-smile, looked as if laughter might start. The children sat at Ayako's feet with rolled hands and bright eyes. That image would become a ledger of memory, a photograph that would travel with them like a compacted geography of the years to come. Her return to Japan was not immediate. There were delays, bureaucratic, logistical, the inertia of a world that is awkward in the face of mass movement. When she did arrive, the landscape she remembered had been painted over by ash and absence in places, and by small pragmatic blossoming in others. Cities were a collage of ruin and nascent repair, scaffolding, shortages, long lines for rice, and the tireless work of people who had not given up. Ayako found employment in a small clinic that had been set up by a combination of local physicians and returning aid workers. Her experience on Saipan made her uniquely valuable. She could teach wound care, triage, and had a practical fluency in the kind of improvisational medicine needed in low-supply settings. But there was also a different type of work that took shape, comforting the survivors who were trying to live in whatever spaces remained. She encountered people who had private griefs that did not align with the grand narratives being constructed in the papers and the political halls. She learned to sit with them and make room for stories that were messy and incomplete. Word of her work in the clinic spread slowly. People asked about the photograph where she stood in foreign tents beside those who had been the enemy. Some met the news with hostility, unable to imagine acts of care crossing lines of national trauma. Others, especially those who had known the cost of wartime aid or had experienced rescue in some form, saw in her a capacity for hands to bridge impossibilities. She did not seek to be exemplary. She simply continued the practical ethic she had adopted years before. Do what is needed when a human being needs it. Correspondence with the camp persisted. Letters from Sarah arrived with news of the island's small transformations. They contained jokes, medical queries, and mentions of people who had once been in the tent and who were now living lives stitched in different geographies. Dr. Thompson wrote less frequently, but when he wrote, his letters read like field notes mixed with a friend's earnestness. Miller sent postcards with scrawled drawings. The papers they exchanged contained a lexicon of glued-together days, of repatriation names scratched through, of anecdotal triumphs and failures. Over the years, Ayako would travel back to Saipan when she could. Sometimes the trips were official. Sometimes they were simple returns to sit on the place where the sea had once been a witness. Each time she returned to the island, she would find remnants of the small hospital that had once been an improbable place of refuge. A rusted tent peg in the sand, a plaque someone had set to commemorate the people who had died there. She would stand, hand on the drilling wind, and think of the way her life had pivoted on a chocolate bar and a canteen of water. As the decades grew, the children she had raised, Keiko, Yuki, Hiroshi, carved lives that were half shaped by the tent and half by Japan's rebuilding. They learned trades and skills, and each carried in different ways the quiet insistence that survival is a thing that demands tending. Ayako helped them where she could. At times she intervened to find foster placements that were kinder than whatever alternatives existed in the chaotic places of rebuilding. She never adopted them in formal legal frameworks in the first months. The bureaucracy of post-war arrangements made that difficult. But in the quiet life of a household, in the steady rotation of chores and lessons, they became family. Ayako's relationship with the American medical personnel remained an exemplar of a particular kind of cross-cultural affection. They exchanged gifts, small things like a pocket mirror, a tin of seeds, a notebook, and they sent each other photographs of grandchildren and maps of where they had traveled. The friendship could be awkward at times. There were unspoken histories on the edges that none of them tried to sanitize. Yet they kept the human bureaucracy of correspondence, holiday cards, postcards noting a safe arrival, letters that explained the small achievements that would otherwise be swallowed by the news cycle's appetite for bigger stories. Occasionally, younger people who had never lived through the war years would ask Ayako what it had been like to be a woman in the place where enemy and medic met. She would tell them the practical parts, how to clean a wound, the smell of boiled cloth, the exact angle for a compress, then add, in a voice that had learned caution, that the real work had been the quiet accumulation of trust. "We gave them our hands," she would say. "They gave us bread and care. The rest was learning to name what mattered." There were darker chapters. Not everyone saw her acts as neutral. In some quarters, suspicion lingered like an old smell. A neighbor once suggested, with a lowered voice and eyes sharp as pinpricks, that her work among Americans had compromised something sacred. Ayako listened, and then she replied in language that was precise and unornamented. "If my hands can stop a child from dying, who owns that hand?" The question cut through many arguments. It did not end them, but it served as a rule by which she lived. Her life became a ledger of small moral calculations. When to speak, when to remain silent, when to intervene in public debate, when to offer medical testimony in courtrooms or committees. She testified sometimes about the practical realities of medical work in disasters, speaking to panels with the modest posture of someone who had learned to measure success in breaths resumed. Years later, indefino in exact dating but clearly far removed from the island days, the photograph taken on Saipan surfaced in an exhibit curated by a small historical society. It stood among other images of war and recovery. People in uniforms, children with smiles that felt both hopeful and haunted, tents lit against an indifferent sky. Viewers often lingered before the image of Ayako and the American doctors. They read the plaque beneath, which framed the photograph as evidence of a peculiar human truth, that care can be given and received across the deepest divides. The photograph got its own life. Letters came from people who had been helped by the field tents, from families trying to find members, from soldiers who had looked into the face of the enemy and found a human reflected back. Occasionally, someone would send a note expressing gratitude for a service Ayako remembered almost casually, how she had held a soldier's palm as he died, how she had sewn a seam that kept a child from infection. She kept these letters in a tin, scribbled on the edges, the ink fading, but the names persistent. The end, when it came for Ayako, was modest and unadorned. She grew older in a way that seemed less accelerated by memory than by the simple passage of years. There were the usual ailments of age, aches that spoke of decades of work, a stiffness that crept into the fingers, but nothing dramatic until sleep took on a different tone. Her last months were spent surrounded by people who had been her family by practice rather than by birth. Keiko, who had learned to be a nurse from her. Yuki, who taught in a village school. Hiroshi, who played rhythms in a community band that once performed for veterans and children alike. The American friends wrote and visited in the way of people who carry a bridge between nations in their bones. On a day when the sun made the rice fields look like a lake of gold, Ayako died in a small room that smelled of green tea and iron. Her hands lay on the coverlet in a posture that suggested work had simply paused. After, people who loved her gathered. Dr. Thompson, now with white hair and a slow, precise gait, traveled to be present. Miller, with a weathered face, stood as if the years had been a single long service. Sarah could not come because of her own obligations, but she sent a letter read aloud by Keiko in front of those assembled. A note of friendship, of the odd compulsion of those who had been called to heal to keep doing so even when the world made less sense. They buried her near a small temple, in a place where the wind sang through the trees. There were no grand speeches. People spoke of small things, of the exact angle of a bandage, of a bowl of rice shared on a cold night, of the way her laugh could cut through the static of more formal talk. The photograph from Saipan was placed inside the folded papers that accompanied her, an emblem of a life that stitched across oceans. After her death, people continued to tell stories. Kiko would tell the children she taught about the woman whose hands had been both saved and saving. Yuki would fold paper cranes at memorial events. Hiroshi would play rhythms in the corner of a community hall when people gathered for evenings to remember those who had been lost. Dr. Thompson and Miller returned sometimes for small ceremonies, bringing flowers and the slow cadence of years to a gravesite that had, in its way, become a place of international pilgrimage for those who believed in the quiet acts of care. The letters kept coming. Old patients sent notes that were equal parts apology and gratitude, acknowledging histories that were never simple. The photograph traveled into books and articles and small museum exhibits. People would stand before it and whisper whatever language they carried and consider the winds that had once made a cave, and then a tent, and then a city. Ayako's legacy did not appear as a manifesto or policy. It lived in the way clinics taught seam techniques she had used, in the way bandage rolling was narrated by nurses who had never met her but had learned from someone who had. It lived in the children's laughter in households across towns she had visited. It lived, perhaps most visibly, in the friendships that continued across oceans. Postcards with illegible scrawls, letters with jokes that had become family artifacts, photographs with corners yellowed and cherished. The title under which many later would tell her story, How American Doctors Healed a Japanese Prisoner, both framed and simplified a life that had never been simple. The phrase prisoner sat like a bureaucratic coin minted in a time of war. It was true in a narrow legal sense once, for a page or two. But the life that unfurled afterward, the work of healing, the decisions to stay and to return, the adoption by practice of children who grew into adults, showed the messier reality. Healing happened in ways both immediate and protracted, in surgical extraction of shrapnel and in the long apprenticeship of trust. In the end, the story could be told as a tale of medical triumph. A woman rescued from a cave, carried to safety, operated on, and saved. That was true in its way, but it would be incomplete without the long pages that followed. The news that stole her past, the nights of conversation with a nurse who spoke broken Japanese, the decisions to stay and to bind lives together, the slow work of reconstruction in a homeland that had been reshaped by ash and policy and the human economy of labor. Healing, in her life, could not be reduced to a single operation. It was a continued practice. On the last page of the ledger she had kept in her household, yellowed now, the ink faded, someone had written one sentence beneath a long list of names and supplies and small acts of service. Caring for a human being is a choice repeated every day. That sentence circulated among the people who had loved her. They repeated it like a prayer, not because it solved anything grand, but because it named a truth both simple and profound. The photograph from Saipan remained one of the most requested images in the small collections where it ended up. People would look at the tired smile, at the hand placed over a child's head, at the uniformed man who had once steadied an anxious world with a scalpel. They would read the plaques and the accompanying essays and ask how such acts could have been possible in a moment when so much had been taken. For those who had lived it, the answer was never simple. It was, instead, a series of small choices. To hand over a chocolate bar even when suspicion pulsed like thunder. To learn a few words in another language because words stitch where politics tear. To offer a hand not because it will fix everything, but because it matters in the immediate measure of a mouth breathing. The last pages of Ayako's life trailed into the larger narrative of a region trying to make sense of itself after violence. She is remembered not in the strict categories of hero or victim, but as a person whose hands steered the course of other lives. The title that frames her story, How American Doctors Healed a Japanese Prisoner, captures a fact. It captures the particular drama of wounded flesh and skillful hands. It captures the strangeness of rescue in a world where labels can be both true and misleading. But the fuller story, the one that outlasts headlines and fits uneasily on a plaque, is of a human being who chose, day after day, to repair what she could and to teach others to do the same. If this story moved you, if the idea that care can cross divides resonated, consider subscribing to hear more accounts like this, stories of the small acts that shaped history and the quiet people who lived them. For deeper reading, check the description for suggested sources and further context on Saipan and the post-war medical relief efforts. And if you know someone who would find this story meaningful, share it. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can do is remind one another that hands extended, even across enemies, change the world in ways that quietly endure.